For a while, Criminality has been a game dominated by a gun meta. This is made very clear since the second you boot up the game and join a server, it sounds like the average day in Chicago. Or by the fact that there is about 1 billion gun montages. Meanwhile, the newest melee montages are literally carbon copies of an older video. Like, you can't make this shit up, bruh. And along with the small amount of new melee content on YouTube, there's not a whole lot of new melee content in game. Now, why is that? Why is there so little content for melees both gameplay and video-wise compared to firearms? And more importantly, why did Criminality's melee meta go extinct? To understand this, we're going to have to go back in time by about 3.5 years. In one of the earliest versions of Crim, known by many as Blood Test 2, you spawned with a katana. And that's it. Melees functioned the exact same way as they do today. There are 3 attack animations leading to a unique combo on that third swing. By killing people with that katana, you received items like grenades, molotovs, and C4, which are all pretty self-explanatory. However, the theoretically most overpowered weapon you could get, the airstrike, is also one of the worst weapons you can get. If you thought the original release of the modern day airstrike was bad, this one will put you to sleep. With this game being a test place, it has very minimal replay value, especially since there is no variety in melees, leading there to be no true meta. The only progression you can make are those kill streaks I just mentioned, and so we move on to the next version. PDS, or what I called it about a year ago, is said to be the best version of Criminality to ever exist. It's not. It just isn't. This version of Crim was extremely primitive, with a bunch of new features being added into the game, including the grinder. During this early version of the game, it was incredibly melee based due to how weak the guns were. Now, there was a vast variety of melees in the game, but by far, the best melees to use were the metal bat, the katana, and the fire axe, each having unique factors that made them strong. The fire axe works like the metal bat's third swing, splitting heads open and cutting off limbs with a single hit. This is its only swing animation, and the combo system has no effect on this melee. The metal bat combined the best of both blunts and daggers, letting you concuss and knock people over like a wooden bat, while also inflicting bleeding in the process. And finally, the katana, an extremely agile sword which inflicted high bleeding damage along with a very strong amount of base damage considering its swing speed. The melees themselves weren't changed mechanically, more so they were polished to ensure that gameplay with them was as fluid as possible. Now of course, just because the melees got polished doesn't mean the entire game was polished. Pre-beta was the official release of Criminality, a game no longer in public testing but now put into paid early access. And with this update, melees weren't really changed all that much. Of course, there was more polishing, added hit markers, and other quality of life changes, but again, the gameplay stayed relatively stagnant. Because of this, the melee meta from PDS immediately returned into this release of Crim, along with a new one being introduced: fists. Fists are a seemingly weak melee at first glance, you'd spawn with them after all. However, your perception on them will change when you hit your first combo. Unlike most other melees that require you to charge up your third swing, the fist's third swing is only accessible when you hit your first 2 shots. And when you hit that third swing, it knocks people over with a little less force than a blunt weapon. Combined with the incredibly low attack delay of 0.1 seconds and low stamina usage, the power on these were unprecedented. If you were good enough, you could infinitely combo anyone, including people with full tier 2 armor, the best armor available at the time. One melee that was drastically changed was the chainsaw. Previously, the chainsaw kind of worked like the fire axe, except a lot slower and a lot stronger. However, in pre-beta, its entire melee system was updated in favor of a charge attack, with it being the only melee in the game to have that mechanic to this day. Since everyone was still learning how to play the game, this melee immediately jumped into S tier, as no one had a clue on how to counter it other than jumping frantically. Fresh meat. Even with multiple updates buffing and nerfing some melees, the meta stayed relatively the same for the first couple of months. That was until the poll.
You should kill yourself now.
This poll let the community decide how every gun's damage would increase by percentage. And of course, the community chose the biggest option available. Like, no brainer, bruh. And in just a blink of an eye, the game's melee meta was completely fine. Surprisingly, it didn't change anything initially, and melees continued to stay as the dominant weapons with their price advantage and efficiency. However, as more buffs were given to the guns, they became stronger, shifting the meta from a melee dominant to about an even playing field. A dream come true for developers. To have their game completely balanced, allowing for any playstyle, everything was perfect. Until 1.2 rolled around. Although guns were already becoming very powerful, 1.2 was a shifting point from a 50-50 to more like a 70-30. Just by joining the game, you could hear AKs, deagles, and double barrels off spawn, something that was rather irregular just a few months ago. There was still quite a lot of people using melees, myself included, but it was very evident that guns had taken the spotlight from melees. The only melees that changed up the meta were the machete and the wrench. The machete being a slower but stronger alternative to the katana, and the wrench being able to one-shot RVVZ off a building. However, the public opinion would begin to sour very, very quickly. If 1.2 was a critical hit backstab to the melee meta, 1.3 was the equivalent of unplugging the life support from it. There were two, technically three reasons why melees were sent straight to the sewers. The addition of charge-ups is conceptually a fantastic idea. It immediately reminded me of Street Fighter, where you'd have to learn button combinations on a controller. Except in Crim, it's a lot more streamlined, where all you had to do was hit your first 2 shots before being able to use your third swing. So pretty much just the fist combo system being applied to every melee in the game. Although this did have a negative effect on the melee's capability and versatility, it surprisingly wasn't the worst change. What really took melees out of the meta was the fact that they removed the ability to cancel reloads. This was what made gun versus melee so viable, an actual threat to the gun user, since it was fully up to them to hit all of their shots to kill the melee user. Now, because there's no fear of your reload being cancelled by anyone except yourself, you can comfortably reload so long as you're about 20 studs away. And if you're point blank to the point where reloading without taking damage is impossible, you can just run for as long as you need, allowing you to get somewhere safe. The only factors that will let the melee user catch up to you are if you mess up your movement, if you have fractured legs, or if they have a rage burst. And finally, the changes to the economy were what dug the melee meta into its grave. A little under 3 weeks after the V1.5 update, they temporarily lowered the prices of melees. Okay, great! Now, melees actually might see some consistent use, as this change can rejuvenate the desirability of melees being a cheap alternative to the rather pricey guns. That lasted for about 3.5 months. Both of these changes would become permanent, which completely counteracted the price buff melees were given. This shifted the economy, which was already in favor of a gun-dominant meta, just completely on the side of gun-dominant because now there was no incentive of buying a melee. But realistically, all of this boils down to the gun versus melee argument, which can be summarized by this scene from Indiana Jones. Of all the fights you engage in playing Crim, it's probably hard to remember the last fight where you were just inches away from your opponent. And even if you can remember a fight like that, you were probably using a gun.